I think that brings us to the next section, which is kind of related to multi-platform React Native, so React Native running on other platforms. And at the end of the day, everybody who's been ever maintaining a separate React Native fork has been running through that kind of problem that you have mentioned. So, so from the very beginning, React Native was obviously about cross-platform, and while it shipped only with iOS and Android, or I think the Android was actually added a few months later, everybody knew that other platforms were eventually just a matter of time when somebody will start working on them. And this year, we've seen a lot of great contributions from our partners in the community, including Microsoft, on additional platforms such as Windows and surprisingly Mac OS. And we have received a lot of questions from our audience on that aspect and in the general direction of the framework in that area. So I think we can start off with a question, with the first question, which is kind of about sharing the code between mobile and web. So with the new platforms being released and becoming production ready, what opportunities do you envision when it comes to sharing code between mobile and web, traditional React and React Native targets, and desktop environments? Do these have a lot or something in common? And I think, Eloy, maybe you want to start, as you are representing actually the Microsoft here as well, and you are working on Windows and macOS ports of React Native.
Yeah, well, so I think clearly any code that is not necessarily UI related or particularly dependent on the OS will be easily shared as plain JavaScript. So that is definitely already a win. I think I can imagine, like if I take the RT app as an example, porting it to desktop means that all the data layer would just work. So the pieces, and then when it comes to the UI, large pieces of the UI would work. I think people are familiar with Catalyst. It would be somewhat similar to that. You are able to leverage most of the UI, but obviously there are some paradigms that you only have on desktop and then some extra APIs. But I think it's always good to reiterate with React Native that it is not about writing once and deploying everywhere, but about learning once and writing everywhere. So this is similar in the case that you will have to put in some care to make an application on the desktop feel like a desktop application, which I think is what the users deserve, right?
Yeah.
For me, at CloudMosa, we had some React Native product. Our first product is about React Native Windows on WPF platform. It's not maintained at all because we have to support Windows 7. And being the first React Native product on desktop UI, we find it has some fundamental differences between mobile and desktop, and I find it is not covered in React Native yet. For example, at desktop UI, you have touchable. You used to have some mouse over feedback, and you also have to support drag and drop and multi-window support. How about if we could support multi-window in also the declarative ways, such as you have some app, and we have window 1, window 2, and below there are multiple views. So I think the desktop is not also covered from React Native, and we have some ways to do that. But in our experience, we had a desktop UI, and we had a Windows platform, and we also co-share for web and Android as well. So we have about 50% co-share rate. So I think it's really doable for React Native.
Nice. That's a very, very healthy number, I think, when it comes to code sharing.
Can I just touch on so it's definitely true, obviously, that things are still up in the air. But when it comes to, for instance, these pointer like mouse events, whatnot, touchable. We are actually currently in the process of working with Facebook, both for the mobile platforms and for the React Native web platform, and for taking into account macOS and Windows, how to best provide a cross-platform API that works for all those.
Yeah, if I recon this, I think there is a discussion and proposals issue or PR about that, where it tries to kind of propose a standardized approach to handling these things. I think I've seen it before, and it's kind of aligned with what you were saying, so it might be interesting. If I find it out, we'll include it with the podcast for those of you who are interested in following up on this.
On this topic, I also wanted to up-level this discussion a little bit. I think while we've been focused mostly on React Native, because I understand that the audience here is about React Native, I think up-leveling this and talking about React platforms as a principle is also pretty interesting, because even in the React world, people have been writing custom renderers forever. This existed even before React Native itself was a platform. For example, we have had some really good demos from Ken Wheeler on React Music, for example, or even Nicholas on the React Native web. Then I wrote a renderer around React Web Workers, which is pretty much React Native. React 360 is actually like React Native in a 360 environment. So I think we've been having this discussion around the principles of up-leveling it and calling it a React platform. And I think this is a blog post that Eloy published some time ago on the React Native blog, where he talks about the concept of, the fact that React itself is a declarative UI paradigm kind of lends to this idea of adding multiple platforms. So with that in mind, if we were to up-level this discussion, the way I see it is React would be the top-level root node, and then things like React DOM, React Native Windows, React Native Android will all be siblings, all of them adding different levels of abstraction, where you can say, hey, maybe the data fetching relay or the GraphQL components can be the same, but all you care about is the leaf node components that are different. I also want to be very, very I want to ensure that we also understand that it's very critical to embrace the platform. Just because we are sharing code does not mean that we give up on the iOS-specific interactions or Android-specific interactions. So I think as people are thinking about code sharing, it's critical to ensure that your app looks and behaves like a native app. And I think that's the biggest promise that React Native brings to you.
Yeah, great, really great point. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of React Native applications are performing and looking better than typical hybrid approaches, just because React Native has been always about embracing the platform. And it kind of brings us really nicely, which is a surprise, to the next question, which is about Flutter, which takes slightly different approach. And we've seen a great Kudo's talk on how we can render React Native components potentially to Skia, which brings us very close to what Flutter potentially is. And there's been a lot of developers talking about Flutter being superior because of being synchronous, and this is getting also kind of outdated as we are getting into the new architecture of React Native. So my question is, do you think this, and I'm talking about this kind of Skia renderer potentially, and this synchronous access is kind of an interesting achievement for the Flutter community, and would it make React Native a sort of interesting alternative and choice for them? What do you think about that?
I heard some people like Flutter because they don't like JavaScript. Okay, I don't have comment for that, and I don't think React Native Skia will inspire them. So for me, React Native Skia is also my self-challenge to learn more about Fabric, and I also want to prove that React Native could extend to another different platform such as Flutter. And the project current state is still far from production because we still miss some critical parts such as compositor, because we want to draw each view in our own. So, but we have some community to do this project, so maybe it will be possible to be a true product. And I would like to borrow some code from Flutter, so maybe the project will be React Native Flutter.
That would be good connection of very great keywords from the search engine perspective, I think. Ram, maybe you want to kind of chime in from the synchronous and asynchronous perspective, because I know you've been always very passionate about these aspects of performance. So kind of interesting to see your perspective on that as well.
So I'm actually a pretty huge fan of Flutter, and I think the people who have developed Flutter have like the architecture that they've come up is like pretty interesting. In fact, if you think about it, React Native has always been about questioning our assumption and looking at how we can stretch the envelope. I think Flutter does exactly that, and Flutter's primary hypothesis is that, hey, why do you need all of these different rendering layers in Android if you can just go directly draw it to the GL layer or directly draw it to the graphics system, right? And that's what makes like Flutter great, because basically what you do is your Dart commands are taken and written to Flutter. And it does it in a synchronous way. Now, that's one of the really interesting things that Flutter offers. And I think Kudo's experiment with React Native is a very good way to figure out how can we combine the ease of development in terms of like declarative UI. So some of the good things about React is that it's easy to reason about. The UI is declarative with things like hooks. You know that, hey, this is the functional part of it versus this is the part where I have a side effect on my component, stuff like that. So this whole developer-friendly developer mindset is taken to the performance area where you're like, hey, now that I've taken care of developer experience, let me also take care of user experience. So I think it's a pretty good exploration. I'm not a great fan of like comparing React Native versus Flutter. I know that the JavaScript community kind of likes drama and tries to say which one is better. Personally, I think that there is like really good things in both React Native and Flutter, and we are starting to learn from each other so well. So in terms of performance, I think like I'm super excited about this whole idea of synchronous, and it's not about like synchronous versus asynchronous. We are now coming to a world where we have realized that both of them are equally important. If you want to respond quickly to user actions, you need to draw synchronously. On the other hand, if something you're waiting for from a network takes you a second, adding 100 millisecond delay is not going to like prevent you from anything. So this whole idea of synchronous and asynchronous as and when needed to ensure that your focus is on user experience, I think that's what excites me about like this whole idea of like React Native Skia and doing it in the synchronous way.
Yeah, I would like to echo that it is a little bit of apples and oranges. They are not necessarily the same thing. And there's obviously always trade-offs involved. If you want to reliably build for multiple platforms with a single code base, with thinking a little less about the specific platform intrinsic details, then that seems more of a case for Flutter than it is React Native. With React Native, as I've said and Ram also said, we always want people to actually put in the extra work to make sure that an application is absolutely adheres to the design guidelines that go into a platform. If I were to build an application and I would not need to think about constraints such as like immediately deploy to all these platforms, then that would probably be a reason for me to stick with React Native, because I really like using those native UIs rather than custom drawn ones. Also, and I'm not familiar in there's no need for me to use Flutter, so I haven't used it either. But I actually quite like with React Native how there's a kind of a hard constraint between the UI code and some of the native aspects. Where with our older Objective-C applications, it's over time in terms of maintenance, it just is always a little easy to do something a little easier where you access code that should be accessed from a different thread in a different place. And I like with React Native how you have to write a little bit of a boundary thing, which makes you think about that and keeps them separate more. So I'm not necessarily looking for a solution where I can do everything natively from a different language. That's how some people view it, I would say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, when you were mentioning, since you brought that up, it reminded me of an interesting use case that I know one of the leading automotive companies has. They are essentially just using Flutter for kind of developing for their custom hardware, and what they are using is they are just able to kind of back Flutter directly into their hardware and just have it as a sort of native language, let's say. So for them, it perfectly makes sense that they can just make it run natively. So it makes me really, really, unhappy because that brand is, one of my top favorites, and I wish they were using React Native, but it looks like I might need to change my brand then. But anyway, the last, always there's always a conclusion about cars at the end of the day, as you can see behind me. But going to the next question, actually, Eloy, that's the one, I guess for you, but I'm pretty sure that others might have some interesting insights here as well from the open source perspective. And we briefly talked about it before in terms of how do you maintain your fork, your platform, when you have to keep your code in sync with the master. And what I specifically would like to understand about it is how do you backport some of the features? So say code gen lands or is kind of turned on by default. How do you make sure that these features work with your fork? Do you have some sort of special syncing mechanism, or is it a very, very hard, manual, painful work? I just it would be great to understand how hard or how easy this might be for you on a daily basis.
Yes, it would be really great to understand. That is basically it. There's a gradient of solutions when I look at what we have at Microsoft, which is React Native, macOS, React Native, Windows. But then also we have some specific patches, for instance, for Android. There's a few different systems. Like React Native Windows is most in sync right now. React Native macOS is most out of sync. React Native macOS currently just means, pulling all the changes from, that's what I'm doing right now, from 0.63, and then reapply, and I'm merging all our forked changes. And the forked changes are literally just, because iOS and macOS code in many cases is so similar, but it is not that easy to have them neatly factored out. They are in line with a lot of if-defs. Luckily, there's a lot of comments that demark those places, but it is a very manual process. The Android one, and also the Windows one, actually, is a little different, where they've extracted all these fork changes into a set of patches that is reapplied automatically whenever the upstream changes are pulled. But just also because macOS, the Windows version, has a little more budget. There's just people that are able to pull more on like a weekly basis, and it makes the whole thing maintainable. That doesn't mean that necessarily all features are used from upstream as is, right? So, well, for instance, at Microsoft, obviously, we use a lot of TypeScript instead of Flow. So the whole code gen aspect, we have a different parser for which generates the intermediate representation that is then used to generate the native code. And then we also have currently in the Windows version, as that's being ported to the macOS version, a slightly different Turbo Modules API. But we're also in talks with Facebook to see if we can reconcile that back upstream. So, it goes in all directions. That doesn't necessarily always make it the easiest thing. But as we're working throughout it, over time, it becomes clear like how the future could look like for out-of-tree platforms. At some point, possibly iOS and Android could be considered treated the same way as out-of-tree platforms, where there's just a core of React Native, and then there's all the platform-specific implementations, and it goes, as you know, Mike, with to the CLI packages, to the native code, and it probably makes it a lot easier that way in the long term to do these things. But right now, it is definitely a lot of a manual process and figuring out together what should move where, as we try to keep that up to date. macOS is definitely, like I said, it's a little lagging behind because of how manual the process is.
Yeah, as you said, from the CLI perspective, we are already kind of doing this by having, iOS and Android commands to ship as a separate packages, which might be hard to describe here in this podcast. But all I wanted to say is that, sometimes I feel like React Native was so great from the conceptual perspective that the variety of out-of-tree platforms were faster to appear than the framework itself was ready for them. And I feel like we are working on that right now to make that, kind of easy for you and other people to integrate with. And I'm happy that from the CLI perspective we are doing small changes, but I'm also kind of excited about the destructuring of React Native into smaller packages. I think there's somebody working on that as well. So exciting times ahead, I think, for out of tree platforms, or actually platforms, because I think somebody banned use out of tree at some point. So let's not use that, I think.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the simple example when it comes to abstracting things, right? It's like, so this iOS and macOS shared code, there would likely be a shared package that is Apple or whatever, Apple code. And then there would be an iOS out of tree or an iOS platform implementation and an macOS implementation that both rely on the shared one. And the same, I imagine, would happen with the CLI packages. Yeah.
So I think that's a great time to wrap up this sort of multi-platform part of our panel. And as I said, looks like we have exciting times up ahead. I can't wait for actually trying out macOS, React Native, and actually trying it Windows again. Back in the day, I only tried C# or C++, and that didn't turn out really well. So it might be a good time.